Welcome to Prevention is Now. I'm Deb Bonner, preventionist and community advocate for Prairie Center Against Sexual Assault in Springfield, Illinois. Sexual harassment in the workplace is a serious issue. In 2016, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission estimated that between 25 and 85% of women have experienced sexual harassment at work. Now, exact numbers are nearly impossible to obtain since the issue often goes unreported. In 2017, an NBC Wall Street Journal poll found that 48% of American women have reportedly experienced either sexual, verbal, or physical harassment at work. And this is not an issue that is unique to women. A 2010 survey in the Washington Post and a 2017 CNBC All-American survey found that 10% of male employees have also experienced sexual harassment at work. In 2020, when so many people found themselves working from home as a result of the pandemic, some thought harassment numbers would go down. Instead, cases of gender and racial harassment have gone up for a variety of reasons. And even though the country is opening back up, the virtual workplace is likely not going away. Many businesses have said they would like to retain at least some remote work options, citing savings in overhead with fewer employees in the office. And some employees have said they want to continue to have the option to work from home because of the flexibility it affords them. So what do we do about the issue of online workplace harassment? What does it look like? What are the risk factors for it? And most importantly, how do we go about preventing that? To answer those questions, joining me today are Holly Milkovich. Holly is the Vice President of Impact at EVERFI, focusing on sexual and gender-based discrimination, harassment, and violence prevention and response, and also Elizabeth Bille. Elizabeth is the Senior Vice President of Workplace Culture at EVERFI, a leading provider of workplace training on a variety of topics, including workplace harassment and inclusion. She is a subject matter expert on harassment, discrimination, and retaliation, and creating positive and thriving workplace culture. So ladies, welcome. And I think first it may be helpful, Elizabeth, just to define what workplace harassment is. So what types of behaviors are involved when we talk about sexual harassment?
Thanks so much, Deb. It's such a pleasure to be with you here today. Thanks for having us. So as a baseline matter, sexual harassment encompasses a wide range of behaviors, but in general, they are sexual in nature. They're unwelcome, and they have some sort of meaningful impact on the conditions of the person's job. Under the law, there are two main types of sexual harassment. So the first involves a situation where someone asks or requires the employee to engage in or to endure sexual behavior in exchange for something else. So to avoid a negative outcome at work or to receive some sort of benefit. So what this might sound like is, for example, if a manager said to their employee, you have a really bright future here. Why don't you come to my apartment and we'll talk about your career? That's often called quid pro quo harassment. The second type of sexual harassment is where harassing behavior creates a hostile working environment. And that can happen either as a result of one really egregious incident, so think like a sexual assault, or more often it's an ongoing pattern of sexual jokes, of suggestive comments, perhaps displays of pornography, repeated flirting or requests for dates, things like that. Now, we often think of sexual harassment as something that happens between a supervisor and their subordinate, but it's really important to keep in mind that others commit these kinds of harm too. So it could be company leaders or coworkers, board members, even vendors or customers, so members of the public can commit sexual harassment. The last thing I did want to say about sexual harassment is that just because an employee participates voluntarily in an exchange, it doesn't mean that that behavior is welcome. So, for example, someone may laugh at a sexual joke the first time it's told in the workplace, but maybe that made them uncomfortable and they tell the person not to do it again. If the person continues telling sexual jokes, or if the person asks them out for another date after they've already said they're not interested, that can constitute sexual harassment.
Now, are these the same types of behaviors we're seeing online, or are there different issues that need to be addressed? What do you think about that, Holly?
I do think that it's really important for us to remember that when we're thinking about sexual harassment in the virtual realm, that a lot of the dynamics of power and control are still at play. So the dynamics may be the same, but some of the tactics shift or some of the opportunities shift when we move to the virtual environment. So let me give you an example. I am coming to you, Deb, from my home. And so this is a time when so many people have invited or been forced to have others be in their home spaces for the first time. And that can create some vulnerabilities or some opportunities that a person who seeks to harass another can really exploit. So here's an example that actually a colleague of ours, Erin Polke from Futures Without Violence, gave, which is to say, hey, nice headboard. Have you dented the wall recently? So sexual connotations related to seeing somebody in their bedroom space that may be the only place where they can get peace and quiet to be able to do their work. Or I see you're coming into us from the living room. I'd love to see the other parts of your home as well. So those sort of connotations of a sexual nature can be a part of working from your home space. Another example is that with the technology that we're using now, we can have some opportunities for more control as it relates to how we are presenting, whether or not we are turning our cameras on or keeping our cameras off. And that can also be used for an individual to sexually harass another. So, for example, encouraging somebody to turn their cameras on because they want to see them. They want to see how pretty they look that day could be one example. Or asking for a person to turn their cameras on for other reasons. So that technology can really cut both ways. I'll also note that, we've been existing from the waist up for much of our work life in the past year, but this really can lead to some of those casual and what sometimes people think of as sort of funny conversations about, hey, I'm not wearing pants today, or I may be business on the top, but I'm party on the bottom. Those kinds of casual comments can create a context where not only are those kinds of comments making individuals uncomfortable, but that can create the context where other kinds of unwelcome behavior of a sexual nature can occur. Certainly there are many more channels of communication that are also being opened in the virtual environment. So we have not just, of course, our Zoom meetings, our Teams meetings, but we also have online chat forums. We also have email. Certainly in this environment, sometimes we have employers who are texting employees on their individual personal phones. So the increase in the number of channels or avenues can also increase the venues and increase the opportunities for harassment. And then I do think it's really important to talk about retaliation as well, because one of the things that we learned from the EEOC, and I expect my colleague Elizabeth will have more to say about this as well, is that in addition to rises in sexual harassment, we also always want to be paying attention to retaliation as well. And the virtual online environment creates novel opportunities to potentially engage in retaliation. So, for example, you can literally mute or silence somebody in a meeting if you have the controls, and that is a powerful tool that for someone who may have brought forward a complaint of harassment and is seeking to move forward, being silenced in important meetings as well as being excluded from meetings is a new tool for retaliation that is a little bit unique for the virtual environment. So the dynamics are the same, but some of our tactics, opportunities, and venues change. And those are important considerations when we're thinking about how we're going to address these issues, both in the in-person environment as well as the online environment, as many organizations are now moving to return to work partially or fully and, continuing the hybrid context.
Now, some organizations think of sexual harassment issues as a problem really just in terms of the legal risk and exposure that they may have if a claim is made. However, I know you want to encourage businesses and organizations to really rethink what those risks are. So, Elizabeth, what are some of the other costs to these entities that they experience as a result of sexual harassment?
You're certainly right, Deb. For many organizations, jury verdicts or legal costs are absolutely top of mind when they're thinking about the ramifications of sexual harassment. But the scope of the damage that occurs is really a lot more far-reaching than just legal damages. It can take a terrible toll on individuals on a personal level, of course. And it can also really hurt the organization's bottom line and their ability to be successful and competitive. So, for example, turnover. One study found that women who've been harassed are 6.5 times more likely to leave an organization than those who haven't. And in fact, research shows that employee turnover costs, those are actually the largest economic cost of sexual harassment, much more than those legal costs. And, turnover is a data point that a lot of HR professionals and organizations are attuned to because it is very, very expensive to have employees turnover. It also hurts productivity. You can have work stoppages. You can have projects that are undone, goals unmet, and it hurts morale as well. Speaking of productivity, there's another study that estimated that for each employee in a workplace that's impacted by harassment, the company loses an average of $22,500 in costs just with that lost productivity. Of course, health impacts. We know sexual harassment can have incredible mental and physical health consequences for the person experiencing harassment and also for the people who've witnessed it and are in that toxic environment. Those can include depression, anxiety, high blood pressure, for example. But for the employer as well, these conditions can result in missed workdays and increases to their health plan costs. So it has a broad impact across the organization. And of course, damage to the company's reputation and brand can occur when harassment experiences are shared on social media, when word gets out that it's perhaps a toxic workplace on sites like Glassdoor, and that can really impact the organization's ability to recruit top talent and to retain that talent, especially today, as we know that employees are really wanting to work someplace with a positive workplace culture and for an organization whose values really align with their own. So the costs truly are broad and very, very deep.
We are speaking with Holly Ryder-Milkovich, Vice President of Impact at EVERFI, and Elizabeth Bille, the Senior Vice President of Workplace Culture at EVERFI. The Equal Opportunity Employment Commission, EEOC, has identified several environmental risk factors for sexual harassment in the workplace. First, what are they? And then would you say, Elizabeth, that these are more or less problematic in an online environment, and why?
Yes, I think really one of the most fascinating outcomes of the EEOC's 2016 task force report on the study of harassment, and that is available on the EEOC's website. But one of the most interesting outputs was that list of environmental risk factors that they published. So characteristics of an organization's culture, of its structure and operations that can increase the likelihood of harassment occurring in that organization or occurring in a particular area of an organization. The EEOC identified about 12 of these risk factors, and all of them are really applicable in an online environment or an in-person working environment. But there are a few in particular that I think are quite relevant in an online environment. So just to name a few, isolated workers, individuals who work alone or only with one or two other people, when there aren't others around to witness harassing behavior. Some individuals, so coworkers, managers, even customers and clients, may feel emboldened by that, and they target employees for harassment given that they think no one is watching. So in an in-person environment, that could impact individuals like housekeeping staff in hotels or night shift janitorial workers, for example. But in an online or remote work environment, it can happen to virtually anyone, given that our interactions are increasingly happening within the privacy, if you will, of one-on-one video calls or chat messages or text. Another one of the EEOC risk factors is workplaces that tolerate or encourage alcohol consumption during work hours. For many employees, when they're working from home, that may provide them with greater access to alcohol during the workday, and much more so than they may have had when they were at a physical work site, for example. And thinking back to early on in the COVID time, how many times did we hear jokes in the media or social media about, I'm working from home, I'm having a drink in my coffee cup, or something to that effect, even though, of course, many employers do have policies that prohibit alcohol consumption during the workday. So it's really important for employers to make clear that if they have policies about alcohol consumption, that those still apply even if you're working from home or in a remote location, and that can help reduce the risk of behaviors or the reduction of inhibitions that can happen when alcohol is being consumed in a working environment. The last one I'd point out that the EEOC identified as homogenous workforces or organizations with cultural and language differences. So those sound different, but they are connected. The EEOC has found that organizations with low levels of employee diversity or organizations that have higher levels of diversity of identities but have low levels of inclusion are at greater risk of harassment. So the dominant group in a working environment may abuse their social or organizational power over the non-dominant group if there's not that effort to support inclusion. And this can really be exacerbated, I think, in a digital environment because we know already that there's decreased formality when we're using digital technologies, and there's lower levels of civility in our interactions online. So that can increase that risk for hostility and harassment against people who are different, of different identities, perspectives, and experiences. So that actually really counsels us to make sure we're connecting our diversity, equity, and inclusion work to our harassment prevention strategy to ensure that we're mitigating that risk factor.
Holly, what other environmental factors do you feel might be unique in the online environment?
You already heard Elizabeth talk quite a bit about the increased informality. There can also be lack of clarity related to policies or processes in the online environment that can increase the likelihood that an individual may misperceive what the expectations are for their context or not be certain of what the resources or processes are that they should employ if they do experience harassment. That is certainly another risk. We've heard already about the isolation that can occur as well. I think in the digital environment, we all not only have a dispersed workforce, but we also often have workforces that are working at different hours as employers have sought to create appropriate accommodations for example, individuals who may also have other home responsibilities like homeschooling children. So not just working in different locations, but oftentimes working at different hours. So that can increase the isolation as well. And then certainly all of the ways in which the work environment itself, when we're in the physical environment, there are many, many different kinds of subtle reinforcement of behaviors and expectations. Often what we think of as the contextual cues for appropriate workplace behavior. That has an important role to play in ensuring that individuals are actually meeting those expectations. And so when we have the stripping out of some of those external contextual cues as it relates to what kind of behavior is appropriate, then we can really see sexual harassment be on the rise. And then, the other piece is that we have not, I think, as a movement, done a great job at increasing the skills that we have related to bystander intervention, related to noticing situations of harm and interpreting them as causes for concern or practicing how to intervene. And so, I think another risk factor is that our skill set in the virtual environment for interrupting negative behaviors at the earliest level possible really have a lot of room to grow. And so, in the absence of that skill set, I think that there is additional opportunities as well. So those would be additional pieces that I would point out.
Okay, so we've identified some of the risk factors and behaviors contributing to sexual harassment in the workplace. We need to do something about it. So you have a framework for creating a comprehensive prevention strategy, Holly. Can you walk us through that framework and what the different levels are and what we need to be doing at each one?
Absolutely. And I have to say, Elizabeth and I are in the business of really not only delivering high quality education and programming, but really encouraging organizations and institutions to think of that programming as really being one part of a comprehensive harassment prevention strategy. So oftentimes what employees will most readily recognize as prevention is the training that we deliver, one-on-one to individuals to increase their knowledge, to increase their skills, and hopefully to change their attitudes and behaviors. But what we know is that training is not going to be sufficient if there is not also other efforts happening across the institution or across the organization to reinforce that training and to help individuals have the best possible environment to use that training to create a positive workplace experience. So those levels, really starting at the bottom, we want to be thinking about institutionalization. So this is that degree of buy-in that we see from senior leaders, visible commitment, and a meaningful investment in effective prevention strategies or initiatives on a long-term, ongoing basis. So we know certainly that one-and-done efforts are never going to really create that long-standing behavior and culture change that we need to see. And so that buy-in, both in terms of senior leadership support in a visible and ongoing way, as well as appropriate investment in personnel and other resources to be able to move forward that prevention strategy, is so important. And then when that is in place, that really enables the critical processes or the key business-related processes that we use to inform the development of effective policies and programs. So this could involve engaging in, for example, a needs assessment to really understand what employees are experiencing in the workplace so that you can really target your efforts effectively. We want to make sure that there is addressing anti-harassment on a large scale as a part of a strategic plan or goal, making sure that those strategic plans or goals have benchmarks to be able to gauge against, to really be able to track progress and make iterative improvements along the way as you learn more information. And certainly we want to be collecting and using data to evaluate programs. Simply delivering a program should not be enough. We want to know what is the efficacy of the program and where do we continue to have places to strengthen, as well as be able to use the strengths that are already a part of an organization. So gathering data really helps to do that. All of that data also then informs policy as well as processes. So this is really the structure that sets the framework for our behavior as well as how we're going to address the behavior. Certainly we want to have policies that are addressing harassment in all of our work environments, including our remote or virtual or digital work environments. We also want to make sure that there's non-retaliation policies that are clear and that are articulated on a regular basis, and strong enforcement and adjudication of those policies, as well as clarity for your workforce around what those policies are, how these policies and processes are adjudicated, so that individuals not only know what the processes are, but see that when individuals come forward, there is an effective process in place and they know that something is going to happen. One of the things that Elizabeth and I have talked with each other and others about on a regular basis is that one of the deterrents to individuals coming forward to have the behavior they're experiencing addressed is that they perceive that nothing is going to happen. Well, oftentimes lots of things have happened in workforces when individuals report behaviors, but what has happened or how an organization has addressed the behavior is not shared more broadly. So the extent to which you can create as much transparency as possible in, for example, making sure that individuals know what will happen if they report, potentially even aggregating data related to reports and sharing it out with the workforce on a basis that is both appropriate to making sure that individuals' experiences are anonymized, but that the aggregate information is shared with the workforce. All of those are really important policy efforts. And then we get to the programming. And that programming really should be both at the universal level, so reaching all members of the workforce, as well as role specific, because we know that managers have heightened responsibilities and need to be able to have the opportunity to practice that skill set to be able to execute those responsibilities as well. That training can really be reinforced by other kinds of initiatives like posters, like regular messaging as a part of other kinds of organizational communications around this issue as well. So all of those things are really that framework for comprehensive prevention. And then the way that we see it really specifically addressed in the digital or virtual workforce is making sure, for example, that senior leaders are continuing to include the digital work environment as they're talking about these issues, to take pains to interrupt misperceptions related to the virtual work environment. So, there may be a misperception that sexual harassment is less likely to occur. We want to interrupt that, and so that we can both make sure that individuals are continuing to stay vigilant, but also to reinforce that if an individual has experienced it, that it is recognized and they can come forward and have the behavior addressed. When we're thinking about critical processes, as you're gathering data about, for example, how that digital or virtual work environment is impacting employees in this current moment or in the in-person environment as well, you want to make sure that you're gathering information about sexual harassment experiences and sharing that information broadly, not only with those individuals who are in the position to be able to make changes to policies or processes to impact it, but also sharing it with your workforce as well, so that you are sharing back to them what you've learned about the organization as well as your plans moving forward. Reinforcing those expectations of norms, policies, and processes in the digital or virtual environment is really important. So Elizabeth noted that the it's 5 o'clock somewhere, happy hour all the time mentality really needs to be interrupted. And one of the ways that you can do that is by reinforcing that those policies related to alcohol or other drug use in the workforce are at play or, really are enforced in the digital workforce as well as in person. And then when we talked about, we don't really yet have that skill set as developed to interrupt situations of harm in the digital workforce. We want to make sure that not only are we not letting off the gas when it comes to that prevention, education, training, programming for all of our workforce as well as for our managers, but really making sure that in that training, in that education work, that you're also including scenarios and role-specific examples of how to interrupt situations of harm in the virtual or digital environment, what it might look like, so that we're making sure that our training is really keeping up to pace with the work environment that all employees are in.
I love the fact that you bring up the can't be one and done, because so often those of us in prevention do help organizations and businesses create policies and plans, but then these groups don't really seem to do much with them other than point to their prevention plan during the annual training or during new employee orientation. So Elizabeth, I know Holly gave a pretty thorough answer, but what does an effective sexual harassment prevention plan look like when it's in action?
Yes, thank you so much, Holly, for all those great examples. I think I would just add a couple of more thoughts here. One, I think, especially in the corporate environment, we need to, as a baseline matter, make sure our colleagues are all on the same page about what we mean by a prevention plan. I think a lot of organizations have taken a more myopic approach to addressing harassment, taking legal compliance and making it synonymous with prevention in their mind. So thinking that, we have a training and a policy in place, that's a prevention program. But really, that's not. That's incident response. That's first aid. What we need to do is stop the harm from occurring in the first place. And what that requires are those ongoing, proactive, and action-oriented elements that Holly just discussed. A year-round effort and shifting that focus to what happens before the complaint is made, not simply after the harm has already been done. So to do that, as Holly mentioned, it involves training on those skills that help employees spot warning signs, those upstream behaviors that haven't yet reached the level of harassment, sexual harassment, but if left unchecked, could continue to create that hostile work environment that we talked to before, intimidation, inappropriate comments, things like that. Routine communication Again, like you said, it can't be a one and done, once a year, roll out of the training and the policy, have everyone click to acknowledge and then forget about it for a year. Keep talking about these issues by disseminating your policy throughout the year, by having messaging campaigns from your leadership in particular. That can be incredibly powerful. Talking about the kind of inclusive, positive workplace that we all want to have, and it's critical that we all have. That not only keeps these issues top of mind for employees all year round, but also demonstrates organizational commitment to preventing harassment in the workplace. And that can really go a long way to prevent harm. And assigning accountability for these measures, quite honestly, putting the prevention work and progress against goals in performance evaluations, evaluating supervisors and leaders to make sure that they are supporting and actively championing the kind of workplace that is hostile to harassment. Having that accountability, and of course, as Holly mentioned, active enforcement is very important. So these are some things that we can do to keep harassment prevention and positive workplace interactions top of mind and really make them a part of the fabric and ethos of the organization.
Holly and Elizabeth, thank you for talking with us today. We're starting to run out of time, so is there anything else you would like to add before we wrap things up?
I just really want to, again, continue to encourage organizations to really see their comprehensive sexual harassment prevention strategy as being core to their business success. Too often, I think that we imagine these things as being separate, but that really, if an organization is going to meet its business goals, it really has to also meet its sexual harassment prevention goals as well. They are part and parcel of each other. And so, this really needs to be on the hearts and minds of every senior leader of an organization or institution.
And what I would add to that is also it's important for organizations to shift their thinking, I believe, about risk and their view of individuals who come forward and report concerns. Organizations, lawyers, et cetera, sometimes tend to think that reports are a bad thing and we need to prevent reporting from happening because that means something's wrong. Actually, reporting is a positive thing. That signals organizational trust. It signals employees who want to do the right thing to make things better. And so if we can create the conditions where employees feel safe to come forward, where they know that they won't be retaliated against, and they know that action will be taken, they will be primed to raise concerns when they're still at the lowest levels of seriousness and harm, and therefore the organization can respond before harm has been done and before legal liability has attached. So changing that perspective about risk and reporting, I think, can go a really long way in preventing harassment in the workplace.
And finally, what would be some good resources for people who want to find out more about dealing with and preventing sexual harassment in the workplace?
Well, first I would say that we here at EVERFI have been pleased to be able to share some strategic resources for any organization to use to be able to assess the readiness of their organization to address these issues and to create some opportunities to really dig in to create that comprehensive prevention strategy. We also have a couple of cost calculators to help organizations get a better sense of what it really looks like to what the cost savings are and the business advantage it is to address sexual harassment effectively. Additionally, I would note that our colleagues at Futures Without Violence have created really excellent resources on workforces responding to sexual harassment. Certainly would encourage organizations to use those resources as well. And, our colleagues at Valora and Prevent Connect have created some great resources and webinars on this issue as well. So really thinking about high quality, research-informed best practices resources for your organizations.
I would simply add the EEOC task force report and their list of risk factors. And they also have a lot of checklists for checking your policies, checking your training against the practices that they've determined to be effective in that task force report. Those are all available on the EEOC's website and can be tremendously helpful as you're building out a strategy.
Holly Ryder, Milkovich, and Elizabeth Bille from EVERFI, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
This has been Prevention is Now. I'm Deb Bonner, preventionist and community advocate for Prairie Center Against Sexual Assault. If you would like more information or have questions about this program, you may call our offices at 217-744-2560 or send me an email at dbonner@prairiecasa.org. Prairie Center Against Sexual Assault supports children and adult survivors of sexual violence through counseling and legal and medical advocacy in 11 central Illinois counties. Prairie Center offers coaching boys into men for male high school and college athletes, bringing in the bystander training for college campuses, and the state-mandated sexual harassment prevention training for businesses and organizations in our area. Our main offices are located in Springfield, Illinois, with satellite offices in Jacksonville and Taylorville, Illinois. And you can find out more about our services at our website at prairiecasa.org. This program is supported by a grant from the Illinois Department of Public Health and the Illinois Coalition Against Sexual Assault. Points of view or opinions contained in this program are those of Prairie Center Against Sexual Assault and our guests and do not necessarily reflect the official positions or policies of these grantors. Thank you for listening.